there, what you need for your microbes is an energy source, and there's just not much better fast release energy source than molasses. And I've heard the comment made by some people that make some of the BT products that it makes it up to 20 times more efficient. I don't know why they don't put it on the label. Maybe they figure you won't buy as much of it if it works that much better for you. But yeah, I very much like molasses mixed in, especially with products that involve active microbes.
One thing I will find out, mention to you that I did find out, for instance, the deer molasses that you get, I was buying them for $1 a gallon at the end of the season from some of the big box stores. But when you read the fine print, they've all had a fungicide put in them. So please be careful what your sources of molasses are, because they're trying to keep molds and funguses down. Well, that's not what we want. So just be careful where you do get your molasses. They are good ones around, but certainly the deer molasses I was initially buying to add to my compost teas, I think I was probably hurting myself a little bit, so be careful with that.
You know, part of that balance is what we're all trying to achieve, and that's healthy, vigorous, vibrant plants. When we have that, I don't think we need to worry too much about the insect problem. And in order to have beneficial insects in the garden, you've got to have something for them to feed on. Of course, they'll feed on some pollen now and then, and they need a good water source. But you have to be tolerant of a few of the insects that most folks consider something to go out and spray, or you have no beneficials. They're meat eaters for the most part, and otherwise pollen. And so we need to be tolerant. I think that's one of the keys also.
And as Malcolm taught us all a long time ago, a lot of times when the bugs show up, that's Mother Nature's way of saying, this crop's done, get it out of here. We're here to clean it up. I mean, it's time to be pulling up that broccoli and that mustard and that spinach, and those things are done. Don't view insects on that as a problem. It's time to pull those things up and plant the okra and the peppers and things like that. At least that's the way I feel in my garden. Yes? Where are we starting? Back here?
Yeah, one for Stuart and probably you, Bob. Organics are safe for pets and people and all that, but our kids' bubbles that they blow out a little bottle are, the safety aspect of all these things that we're spraying.
Okay, I want to talk about that in just a second. Pepper Joe, do you have a comment?
Yes, John, you said earlier that you've been working with Mel Bartholomew, and on his website, the last time I looked, he's a big advocate of mixing up peat moss with it.
He's big on peat.
So we changed.
The question was, Mel Bartholomew, who's father of the square foot gardening, is big on peat moss. How do you feel about that?
Well, I understand that. He comes from up in that part of the country. Peat moss is very easily available, affordable, and so that's why he talks about it. And when he started this thing, I don't know, 30 years ago, maybe more, when he was on PBS with his own little show, there wasn't coir fiber. And so he wasn't real familiar with it. So I put together the mix and used the coir fiber because we wanted to use that instead of peat. And we showed it to him. And we sent him some samples. We sent him several bags, and he had very good results. So that's he's opened up a little bit and accepted that one now. And it's doing very well for us. And you can see it at work at our Ladybug booth. We have a square foot garden set up down there. And the coir fiber is just as open as anything. It just doesn't have the low pH of the peat, but that's the only thing.
Guys, peat moss is antimicrobial. I mean, you want to preserve something, wrap it up in peat moss. I was in Ireland a few years ago and saw a chunk of butter they figured had been thrown in one of the peat bogs 100 years before, and it was perfectly preserved. Things that fall into peat bogs just simply don't break down. And that's what peat moss is all about. It's antimicrobial, and everything you've heard from this panel so far today is you need those microbes in the soil. To me, it's just very foolish to be putting in something that's going to be fighting the very life that you're trying to build in the soil. I can't imagine, using peat moss in our mixes these days when coir is a waste product in large parts of the world, and it does all the good things that peat moss does, so far as I can tell.
And I did some tests between the two. I planted a bunch of plants in pure peat and some in pure coir. The coir outgrew the peat. So
Coir is coconut fiber.
Where do you get it? It's becoming more widely available. It's in an unusual form right now, and we will be packaging it real soon loose. But it comes in a brick, and most of us as gardeners, aren't accustomed to buying a brick somewhere and taking it home and gardening with it. But when you put it in water, it expands rather dramatically, and so that's the way it is right now. But we're going to be putting it out in the bulk bag form before too long.
Yeah, you'll find it as a brick, and in some cases you'll find it as a loose material. But do compare how much it yields. You're going to find some differences in prices. I'm going to start over here and then come right back over this way. Yes, sir. Let's talk about coir and things, and we'll get to other questions. You want to talk about coir?
No, I just have a question.
Okay, we'll come back in just a second. Yes, sir.
And how do you spread the peat moss? You just spread it on the top of the soil?
The core.
The coir?
The core? The coconut?
Well, we blend it into our mixes.
Can I put it on-
Use
can I put it on
as
top
a
of the
little
soil?
peat. So however you would use peat moss in the past,
You mix
you'd
it
use
in.
it in the same
You
way.
don't
You
put it
blend
on
it in the
top.
same.
It's not a
mulch, right?
Yeah.
So you put a 3-inch layer on top as best you can, and then work it down 8-10 inches, and that really helps. But it's not alive, and so you've got to add some compost to that, and that's how we do it.
So you mix it in the compost bin?
You can do it at the same time, of course, yes, you do it all at the same time.
The main purpose of it is to loosen up.
Right.
To get air.
It's not, to get air in, not to feed.
Well, it's dilution plus that organic material.
Right.
It is a good source for organic material. Other things about coir? Yes. In the back, did you want to talk about coir, or want to move on to other questions?
What about the salt content in it?
There's
We've heard over the years you really had to watch the salt content in it. I think we're finding out that in a lot of cases, the salt we're talking about here is sea salt. And little sea salt can actually be very beneficial in the garden. I've not seen any sodium problems at all in our soils, and I've not seen any problems with coir and salt-related issues with that.
The coir that had salt problems were out of Mexico, and they were actually collecting the coir on the sea coast. And they've since, talking to a couple of guys that distribute this stuff, have since changed the way they're doing it. And I don't think you got a problem with it. There was a time when there was some sodium in, well, sea salt, which isn't even bad, in some of the Mexican coir, but I think those days are over. I haven't seen any more in 2 years or so.
Very good. I told the gentleman, more on coir? Yes.
Well, this is on peat moss. Let us just say you built a rather large bed using the lasagna method. So now you've got the bed and you got peat moss down at the bottom of it, and you're doing all these other things to try to encourage the microbial activity. I would not like to hear that I should get down there and dig it out. I don't really want to hear that, but what I do want to know is there anything I can do? Or do I just need to get down and dig it out?
The microbes are going to eat the peat moss up eventually, aren't they, John?
I guess over a long time, they're going to break it down.
How long?
But you're talking maybe 1% of your soil is compost. That's not really a significant amount. I wouldn't be concerned.
I wouldn't be overly worried about it, that's too much. And keep using the compost tea to kind of buffer the
But
problem.
you pick up the microphone.
Oh, okay. So I could hear you. The compost tea would really be the way to continue to buffer that. And you know, there's many ways to make lasagna.
Many different recipes. Until this gentleman would answer his question next.
For several years, we received good fruit from a young pear tree in the middle of our garden. But this year, after small pears formed, blight took over real fast. What can we do to prevent that on another year?
Question is about blight on pears and pear trees. Who wants to answer that?
It seems that once it's, you know, the control is to cut it out of there and to clean your pruners every time you make a cut. But it seems to come back. You know, there is a product that's out there, it's a streptomycin, it's called AgriStrep, that's been used in the past to spray on the flowers, but we depend on the bees, and so we don't need that. But that was one of the traditional controls, and I don't know another one other than to mechanically remove it.
I think you also have to look at the growth on the tree. Blight, fire blight, and most other diseases hit very soft succulent growth. What makes soft succulent growth? An excess of water and chemical fertilizers and pruning. So I would say keep your pruning to a minimum. Stay 100% away from chemical fertilizers. And in a wet year, you're just going to have to put up with a little bit of it. I'll take the rain. Fruit trees, and we ought to have one of the Fanick boys in here. But pear trees are rated according to their blight resistance. And you may not find a good soft pear for this area, but a lot of our old hard pears are among the most blight-resistant trees out there. And they're really the only pears that we usually recommend for this area. Okay, general questions. We'll just sort of work our way around the room. Yes, ma'am.
I have a Myers lemon tree, about 5 years old, in a pot. Has a ton of blooms early, but it doesn't set much fruit.
Myers lemon doesn't set much fruit on.